با عرض سلام و ارادت از حضورتون معذرت میخوام که صحبت من به انگلیسی خواهد بود. So please forgive me for that. Like everybody else, I wanted to thank the organizers of this delightful conference. In particular, Mina, my dear friends Mina and Muhammad. And I also want to thank all of you for being here, for giving us a chance to share some thoughts with you and to benefit from your boundless experience and knowledge. I feel honored to be here, and I feel honored to be invited to such a meeting. I want to talk about Badasht, Seneca Falls, and the freedom of movement. As you know, these are exhilarating times in the Middle East and North Africa. From the Green Movement in Iran to all these other uprisings that have come to be known as the Arab Springs. You can't hear me? You can't hear me? So what's the problem? People across the region are demanding their democratic dignity and human rights. For me, it is the unprecedented number of women facing bullets and batons with open hands and life-affirming words that is a harbinger of a new era. Like the man who stood in front of Tiananmen Square, these women are the messengers of a non-violent struggle for peace and justice. No wonder images of iconic women have replaced images of gun-toting men carrying guns in their hands and screaming death to this or that. Whether it's the heart-wrenching image of Neda Agha Sultan or this young Egyptian women challenging men to meet her at the square, you notice a complete reversal of the order. Women are demanding expansion of their rights as citizens. But these massive crowds of women now pouring into the streets have not appeared on the scene out of nowhere. They are not the first of their kind. They are, in fact, the daughters, the granddaughters, and the great-granddaughters of successive generations of women who sacrificed life and limb in the name of equality and gender equity. Social movements are not like pregnancies. You cannot trace them back to a single event or a single date. Nonetheless, I think that it would be fair to say that the beginning of women's movement in Iran, and I believe in the Middle East and North Africa, began in Iran in 1848. Men and women were prompted by religious reform movements. They were encouraged by forces of modernity. They were exasperated by the injustices of a sex-segregated society. It might seem improbable today, but it was indeed in 1848 that two important conventions, one in Badasht and the other in Seneca Falls Convention, were to make history in the world. In that year, in the small town of Badasht, a number of novelties happened. To me, one of the most important of these innovations was related to women, and in fact, to women's freedom of movement. What later, much later, came to be known as Article 13 of the Declaration of Human Rights. When Tahereh Qurratul Ain, an Iranian woman, a poet, walked into a congregation of 81 men, she inserted herself into a forbidden all-male territory. She was demanding integration in a segregated society. She was leaving behind the proper place for a woman in Iranian society. She was appropriating male spaces and male roles. She was demanding an end to sexual segregation, perhaps not only in words, but in her acts, which always speaks louder than words. Although many, including myself, in my earlier writings about Qurratul Ain, have focused on her unveiling in Badasht, I have come to believe that her presence, albeit an unveiled one, at that convention was the one thing that scandalized the overwhelming majority of the men present. As many of you know, pandemonium rose. Some men panicked. Others were speechless. Enraged by her act and bewildered by her presence, some covered their eyes, others stopped their ears. One man raised his sword against her. Another, one Abdul Khaliq Isfahani, feeling violated and distraught, directed his anger towards himself. He cut his throat with his own bare hands and left the premises and the pages of history. Remarkably, the dawn of a new age in Iran began by the startling presence of a woman in a gathering of men. Soon after her appearance, as expected, Tahereh was arrested. As you know, she was placed under house arrest in the house of the mayor of Tehran, and eventually, at the heights of her creative powers, she was executed at the age of 36 in 1852. Unlike male Babis, who had a very public and cruel executions, hers was shrouded in secrecy and in the darkness of night. Even her execution had to be covered and veiled. Tahereh's life, like her death, is a taboo topic inside Iran, even 160 years after her death. There are no available archives. There are no prison records. There are no pictures, no smug shots of this prisoner, who I think must be the first female prisoner in contemporary history of Iran, and perhaps also the first woman to be sentenced to death by a governmental decree. There is, however, a unique image of Tahereh carved during her lifetime and preserved against all odds in an unlikely place. I'm referring to the tombstone here. It's the mausoleum of the Shahidi family in the city of Qazvin. Then inside it, on the tomb of Mullah Taqi, Qurratul Ain's father-in-law, against all Islamic laws, to the best of my knowledge, there is this craving. I'm sorry that it's not clear. It's my photography, which is also not very artistic, but I will tell you what it is. Because it's diffused, you can't see it. A man is praying, and there are two men stabbing him from behind. In that corner, almost behind a curtain, there is a woman. She's holding something in her hand. I think it's a piece of paper, incriminating enough. This is a woman who can read and write. Underneath the tombstone are written these words: the martyrdom of Mullah Taqi by a Baha'i heretic. Who is the Baha'i heretic charged with this murder? Why the singular reference to one Baha'i heretic if we see quite clearly that there are two men who are stabbing Mullah Taqi to death? We know from history that it was made clear that Tahereh had not killed Mullah Taqi, perhaps only predicted it. The real murderer, one Mirza Abdullah Shirazi, admitted to his guilt and in fact even presented the authorities the bloody dagger with which he had assaulted the mullah in the mosque. However, the person who commissioned the carving, Tahereh's estranged husband and the son of Mullah Taqi, Mullah Muhammad, remained unaffected by his wife's acquittal. He continued to hold her culpable, or at least complicit, in the killing of his father. Mullah Muhammad was wrong in his allegation of homicide. But I think, in a way, he was very astute in recognition that patriarchy, at least as he knew it in Iran, was ending, that there was the beginning of a new era, that the killing of the patriarch and the presence of a woman in public spaces were becoming simultaneous. I know we were told to cut our talks a little shorter, so with your permission, I'm just going to refer to a couple of novels that are fantastic and refer to this seismic change that were brought about by Tahereh. The first, of course, is a masterpiece of Persian literature, Tuba and the Meaning of Night, by Shahrnush Parsipur. Many of you might not even have noticed that the generating power behind the plot of Tuba and the Meaning of Night is Tahereh Qurratul Ain, although she remains unnamed in the book. But it is quite clear, and in fact I have even verified with Shahrnush herself, that it is Qurratul Ain. Haji Adib, the male protagonist in the novel, is undergoing a chaos in his life. He has suddenly realized that the world is not flat, but he has also learned that women can think. And he has done so because he has been exposed to the life, to the work, to the rumors about this woman who is a fantastically erudite woman, but who is also subversive. So the whole plot of this Iranian masterpiece, published inside Iran, revolves around this realization that things are changing. So you might remember that Haji Adib changes his plans and buys books for his daughter and also gives her a globe. Very significant. Another novel, I won't have time to go into it, it's Bahi'i Nakhjavani's absolutely delightful book, The Saddleback, and of course another novel, The Women Who Read Too Much, who unfortunately has been translated into many languages, but not into Persian, and although it was written originally in English, it has not even been published in English in the US yet. So there might not be mentions of Tahereh Qurratul Ain in novels published in Iran, even in novels that recognize the significant role she has played in her country. There might be no pictures of her unless it's a carving on a tombstone blaming her for being a murderer. But there is a fantastic image in Seneca Falls Convention in an interfaith institute. It's a tapestry, as you see, depicted on the left is the figure of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. As many of you know, she is considered by many the foremother of women's movement in the US. And underneath the image, it says Convention in Seneca Falls, New York, July 1848. Represented in parallel on the right side of this tapestry is the figure of Tahereh. She's walking out from behind a curtain. We see her in half profile, almost in a dialogue with Cady Stanton. These words are inscribed above the portrait, Conference at Badasht, Persia, June 1848, and underneath the portrait is inscribed the caption, a sentence attributed to Tahereh Qurratul Ain: "You can kill me as soon as you like, but you cannot stop the emancipation of women." Seneca Falls in upstate New York was the location for the first women's rights convention in the United States. There were 260 women and 40 enlightened men in that meeting. In Badash, as you know, there were 81 men and one lone woman, Tahereh Qurratul Ain. Now, I have written a whole chapter comparing Seneca Falls and Badasht. With your permission, I'm just going to cut that section short so that I can finish everything in time. Just to say what to me is the point that is very similar in both conventions. One convention is very well known. There is hardly a book about women's movement in the world in which Seneca Falls is not mentioned. To the best of my knowledge, there is not a single book that places women's movement in a global context and refers to Badasht as also the locus of an incredible novelty brought about women's issues. Theological issues are not my field. I am not a religious scholar. So all I'm talking about is from a perspective of a woman looking at these two conventions and comparing them from only that perspective. In both of these events, I think what was at the center of the attention of the women present at both conventions was the issue of their freedom of movement, their freedom to live, in the case of Tahereh and Darun, to stop being a virtual prisoner, and to have access to the public domain. In both conventions, women refused to remain silent to keep away from the pulpit and from public preaching. They didn't want to remain hidden in domesticity, although they did not deny it, but they didn't want it to be their sole purpose in life. They did not want their bodies or their voices associated with enclosure. Whereas one, the Seneca Falls Convention, wanted to amend the American Constitution, the other, Badasht, questioned the interpretation of canonical Islamic laws as immutable and struggled to revise religious texts. Now, Tahereh, who had inherited the old maps of sex segregation from her culture, rejected them through her poems. She has many beautiful poems about that. She doesn't use the word freedom of movement, but it's all about being free, going places. She questions why she has been restricted, why her body, her voice, her knowledge is being put under lock and key. Throughout her short and eventful life, Tahereh fought against the partitioning of space, against the limiting movement of body, voice, and mind. According to Peter Smith, she defied and she defied and scandalized social conventions with the freedom with which she spoke, circulation of her voice, and she traveled, circulation of her body. You know that it's hard to pin her life down. She went from Qazvin to Najaf to Baghdad to Karbala, returned to Tehran to Mazandaran. And remember, we're talking about mid-19th century Iran. The women in Seneca Falls Convention, too, wanted the same right for freedom of movement. Let me just give you one example that captures so beautifully what they wanted. Susan B. Anthony, years later, a very close ally of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, said, bicycle is the freedom machine. She said, it has done more for the emancipation of women than anything else in the world. Now, I want to take a minute to say that restricting women's freedom of movement is not the monopoly of the Iranian society. It happens to different degrees and in different ways in all cultures. Look at the symbol of femininity and masculinity. The mirror of Venus, symbol of femininity, is held in place, whereas weapons of Mars, symbol of masculinity, is upward-looking, is free, is unattached. As you know, for centuries, women had their feet bound in China. It literally broke their bones and restricted in their freedom of movement. Cinderella, one of the most popular fairy tales in the world, comes from China around 10th century, the beginning of foot binding. The qualification of Cinderella, as you know, were her tiny little feet, and I'm taking that as a metaphor of someone whose movement is restricted, Zane Sangino Samet, who doesn't move much and who is also silent in public. Barbie, you know, she has the feet of a 4 or 5-year-old girl. And of course, the counter-ideal woman, not only in the US, in many parts of the world, is the witch, an old woman with big flat feet, but also a woman who is flying, a woman who is mobile, a woman who turns her broomstick, the very sign and symbol of her domesticity, into a vehicle to export her, to take her, to transport her to forbidden places. And of course, our myths, our literature is filled with women as sleeping beauties. if men are the charming prince arriving galloping on their horses, the ideal woman is the sleeping beauty. Freedom of movement is at the center, I believe, of women's equal right. I won't have time to go into why. Maybe in the Q&A we'll have time to go over that. But I want to end with what I think is fascinating and is happening in Iran today. As you know, in 2006, a campaign for 1 million signature, which is a nonviolent civil society initiative, was launched in Iran. And significantly, although no attribution is mentioned, the motto of the campaign for 1 million signature is face-to-face, street-to-street. I find this to be brilliant. I also find it to be an acknowledgement, a recognition of a foremother of women's freedom, of women's fight for gender equity. I want to end with this poem, probably the most anthologized poem of Tahereh Qurratul Ain. Also, as my dear colleague Mr. Jabbari referred to it, many argue that in fact this is not Tahereh's poem, but we believe it's hers. And to me, having studied her life for 30 years, I think it really captures her. And this is the famous poem, گر به تو افتادم نظر چهره به چهره رو به رو شرح دهم غم تو را نکته به نکته مو به مو. I would explain all my grief dot by dot, point by point. If heart to heart we talk and face to face we meet. To catch a glimpse of you, I'm wandering like the wind, from house to house, from door to door, from place to place, from street to street. Separated from you, the blood of my heart gushes from my eyes, in torrent after torrent, river after river, in wave upon wave, stream after stream. This afflicted heart of mine has woven your love to the stuff of my life, strand by strand, thread by thread. In this poem, Tahirih becomes one with the wind. She runs away from the space socially prescribed for women. She leaps into the arms of the wind to reach the wider world. Sorry, I have to not read everything, but let me just end with my last line. Listen to the voice of Tahereh as she continues to inspire men and women around the world, but also inside her country of birth. Listen to her message, which cannot be handcuffed, put behind bars, muffled, or executed. Listen to her voice. Like the wind, like her poem, it is unstoppable. It is untrappable. Thank you.